Good evening. This is Mae Bressel in Carmel, California. It's December the 15th, and this is tape number 367, side 1. This is part 3 on the story of Guyana. I hope that the other tapes are making sense to you. I'm getting a lot of phone calls and letters about them, and I'm trying to put this tragic event into the proper order, the way I see it, and see if the news that comes out in the years to follow fits into my original opinions or conclusions on the matter. We're suffering here from an information overload on the West Coast to practically nothing in the Midwest, and a few articles trickling out on the East Coast. I'm getting telephone calls, with the exception of Washington Post, the New York Times. I'm getting calls around the country from people who are getting absolutely no news about the Guyana affair. And on the other hand, out here on the West Coast, of course, where the families are involved, the newspapers are filled with a lot of information, so that I have thousands of articles here, and now there are books coming out on the subject, and I'll try to put them into some order for you. Before I begin on that, I hoped to get out some letters for those of you that take the tapes every week for a long, long time, and wish you a Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays. There's just too much mail and too many things coming down, so I won't be able to get around to it personally. I really wanted to. Suffice it to say I love you. Some of you are just like my family. I'm very, very close to many of the people who have subscribed to these tapes or Tape Dialogue Conspiracy for many years. I'm going back 7-8 years to tape the radio programs, and I keep in contact with many of you, almost day-to-day basis, a lot of you, an extension of my personal family, and have become close. So I'm thinking of all of you at the holidays, and I just want to say hi and have a good year. And I know we'll keep in touch as we've been doing in the past, but in place of sending a card, I'm saying Happy Holidays, Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, or whatever it is you celebrate. Now to the story of Guyana, Part 3. There are many articles, as I say. There's an interesting article that those of you who are serious researchers should obtain. It's December the 4th, 1978, and it's a long story about the Leighton family. Just yesterday, the son, Larry Leighton, took the responsibility for the shooting of several people at the airport in Guyana. And there's a long article. It's called The Leighton Family's Tragedy, From Hitler's Germany to Jim Jones' Commune. That's an interesting title because this commune has been compared to a concentration camp. And I knew that the mother of Larry Leighton came from Germany, and that his sister was one of the people in charge of the financial affairs of Jonestown. And Debbie left and tried to expose what was coming down just months before this terrible event took place. But there's a long article. I'm going to discuss that for a few minutes for those of you that don't get the New York Times, and if you can't get a hold of it. But in the corner of that article is a picture of Dr. Lawrence Leighton, and it has his biography, the story of his life in the article, but there's a picture of him. And if you take the picture of Dr. Lawrence Leighton, Monday, December 4th, 1978, it's a New York Times story, and you look at that picture. The story was written by Robert Lindsay. And then go to Time magazine, April the 11th, 1977, and see the picture of George de Mohrenschildt. George and Jean de Mohrenschildt were Lee Harvey Oswald's CIA agent contacts in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. George de Mohrenschildt was shot just prior to being called before the House Select Committee on Assassinations, a primary witness, and he was in the Defense Department, worked for the Defense and State Department, and was arrested as a Nazi spy during World War II. He has the highest links to the Tsarist Russian, the Solidarists, and the White Russian community, and the Gestapo. And George de Mohrenschildt's picture was in Time magazine, April the 11th, 1977. And if you take that picture and look at the photograph of December 4th, 1978, of Dr. Lawrence Leighton, Leighton was born in America and goes back many generations, his family in American history. But it's an amazing picture of the eyes, the eyebrows, the hairline, the ears, the chin, the nose. If the biography in the New York Times weren't stated, if that weren't true, I would say that Dr. Layton was some relative of George de Mohrenschildt. We know that his brother, von Mohrenschildt, worked at the Hoover Library at Stanford in Palo Alto. And Stanford Research has been a part of this mind control program, this experimentation of the SLA and the UCLA school, and connected with Hughes Medical Institute, the doctors, through the mind control drugs and experiments. And I think it's interesting. Von Mohrenschildt is at Stanford University, and Dr. Lawrence Layton is up in Berkeley, and almost all the members of his family were involved in People's Temple and were involved in giving money to them through secret funds or whatever, sources and open funds. And these pictures are just amazing, and it's just worth passing on to you because you should check them out and see what he looks like. There was an article in the Black Panther paper this last week that thought that there was a small neutron bomb or testing of mass deaths down in Guyana because it was perfectly obvious that nobody was to set foot into the compound until everybody was good and rotted, and then they could wear masks and come in and pick up the people and take them away. I don't know whether that's true or not. We have no way of knowing whether it was just cyanide and injections that they took because there are so few autopsies except on 7 people so far. But the article in the New York Times, December the 4th, is very interesting on Dr. Lawrence Layton. It describes his family as being intelligent, have plenty of money, education, and a proud tradition of Quaker nonviolence. Now, that's kind of a contradiction because if you talk about Ruth Paine, who housed Marina Oswald, as devout Quakers, her husband worked for Bell Helicopter during the height of the Vietnam War, and even a gentleman claimed that he received a rifle from Ruth Paine that was later found identical to one found in the Texas School Book Depository. We know that Richard Nixon was a Quaker and espoused nonviolence, if the Quakers are nonviolent, and yet pushed napalm and weapons and war in Southeast Asia and Cambodia and Laos. And the one religion, whether it's Catholic, Jewish, Quaker, or whatever their policy, the Ten Commandments says, thou shalt not kill. Yet Henry Kissinger, whether he's Jew or Gentile, certainly believes in killing. And if you don't believe it, look what's going on over in Iran and Nicaragua and all over the entire world. The State Department, people who are highly religious, don't think a thing about killing. So the New York Times has a big cover story about their great Quaker cover, but their tradition of nonviolence, which is a contradiction to everything that Robert Lindsay goes on and writes. He says that Lawrence Layton was at Penn State University getting a doctorate in biochemistry when he met Lisa Phillips. That's Larry Layton's mother. I think that's interesting, too, because de Mohrenschildt was in Pennsylvania. His first wife, when he came to this country, was from there, the Sharples family, very high up socially. And there was a large article on the Pennsylvania connections to the various conspiracies and assassinations. But Lawrence Layton needed a tutor. Again, another similarity of Marina Oswald living with Ruth Paine, who needed a tutor to learn the Russian language. In that case, Lawrence Layton here needed a tutor, and he met Lisa, and we'll go into her biography. That's the mother of Larry Layton, who's now confessed to setting off these shootings down in Guyana. He met her in the spring of 1941 and married her in October 41. Again, another quick romance like Lee and Marina Oswald. Their backgrounds, according to Robert Lindsay, the New York Times, were far apart. He was an aristocratic family from West Virginia. Family helped settle Virginia 225 years ago, ancestry back to the Mayflower. They had extreme wealth. The parents had adjoining estates before they married. The property was run by slaves. That would be typical to the Guyana situation. Again, white people directing blacks. I don't think much has changed in the last 225 years. And he was brought up very strictly as a Methodist. His father died. The property they had was sold to Union Carbide plant. In 1946, Lawrence Layton, the father of Larry Layton, joined research for the Eastman Kodak Company in Rochester, worked at the University of Maryland faculty on scientific research. And when Debbie Layton was born, maybe the karma came over on her, poor kid. She was born in Utah in 1953, where her father was promoted Director of Chemical Warfare. The United States Army Dugway Proving Ground in 1951. Lawrence Layton was promoted Director of Chemical Warfare, assigned to develop nerve gas, and he said he was ambitious. They doubled his salary. He became Chief of Biochemistry, Director of Chemical Warfare in Utah, the father of Larry Layton. And this is the family that was going to give so much money and funds to Jim Jones. High-class intellectual college professors, again, overeducated. It reminds me of the SLA, where college graduates, Emily William Harris, Angela Gary Atwood, teachers, college people come out and join a motley crowd and go to the prisons to meet black prisoners and get started in the Berkeley scene to create a lot of violence out in California. Again, from Indiana, the same place where Mr. Beekman, who's now charged for 4 murders down in Guyana, came from, in Bloomington, Indiana, where Jim Jones also went to school. They came to California in 1954. He was Associate Director of Research for the Army's Bureau of Ordnance. He helped develop missiles and satellite weapons and did weapon research until 1957. And in 1957, he came to Berkeley as a research scientist at the Department of Agriculture's Western Regional Research. That's interesting that he was into agricultural research, because one of the necessities that Jim Jones had when he went down to Guyana, that it had to be an agricultural post. And that's Dr. Lawrence Layton, the father of Larry Layton, Debbie Layton, the dead ringer of George de Mohrenschildt. Now his wife, the mother of this lovely family that all became part of Jim Jones' team, the mother went down to Guyana. She died down there. Her son was down there, her daughter-in-laws, and her daughter. One escaped, but the other there. Lisa Phillips, her name is. And again, this is an article by Mr. Lindsay. I talked to Robert Lindsay last week from the New York Times. I wanted him to come here to see some information, and he said, do you have documentation? I was citing some things that I've put on the other 2 tapes and will in the future, and he wanted certain documents. Well, you know, this is the way the New York Times works. They want documentation of the things I'm saying, yet they can write an article go on and on in this long December 4th article on the nonviolence of the Layton family, and preach the philosophy of their minds, of the mother and father. They can go at length about that. And then, as a contradiction, repeat about the biochemistry, the germ warfare, the weapon systems, the missile systems, the chief of biochemistry of chemical warfare, and yet praise his family for their nonviolence. The major media is so full of these contradictions and bullshit. You have to separate always from what they say they are from what they do. And again, here we go to Lisa Phillips. Her father was a wealthy banker in Hamburg, Germany. She came to the United States in 1938. The family was in banking business for 200 years. According to Lindsay, they knew Germany's Jewish aristocracy, the Berensons and the Rothschilds. But they don't also say what Gentile aristocracy or Nazis they might have known there. The story is that Hugo and Anita Phillips were sure that Hitler was going to come down on all of them, so they sent their daughter Lisa to New York City, and that they were put on a train set for a death camp, the parents. This is what the story is. I would really have to do research way back, which is impossible, to get into the Interpol files, and that's why they're so important. According to that story, the parents swallowed poison capsules in a suicide attempt on a train going to a concentration camp, and because they took those capsules, they were removed from the train unconscious, and friends helped them and managed to reach Italy, and they came to the United States. This reminds me of the great escape of Henry Kissinger and his family, who managed to get to the United States also. I don't know of any incidents where people were sick on a train going to a concentration camp and were removed for medical care. I don't think it happened once, and if I'm wrong, you correct me and let me know if you've ever heard of that train stopping because somebody was sick. Incidentally, her mother did commit suicide, finally, a few years ago, Lisa's mother, and then Lisa died down again of cancer. But the mother commits suicide. The father is still alive, and he's living in Germany right now and was sending money to his daughter, Lisa, that went down to Jonestown out of Germany. Her uncle, Dr. James Franck, won a Nobel Peace Prize for physics in 1935. He was at Penn State University, and when she got to the United States, she went to the campus where her uncle was, and it was the same campus where Lawrence Layton was doing his research. Lisa she married Lawrence Layton and then moved around with him to Rochester, New York, I guess with the Kodak people, then to Maryland, then to Provo, Utah, and then to Berkeley. And she, according to the article, became a Quaker, and they both decided they would never tell their children that she was Jewish. And according to this story, Debbie Layton found out that the mother was Jewish when she was in London. The people, this family, the Layton family, didn't like hippies. They lived in Berkeley. They didn't like, in quotes, if you can believe the New York Times, the long-haired young people who were attracted to the Berkeley campus. And the motive for getting her interested in Jim Jones was that he had direction. Now, this zombie freaked-out man who's pulling chicken livers out of toilets and smelly livers out of your throat, it's really hard to believe that he could influence a woman who grew up with bankers and scientists and Nobel Prize winners and PhDs and the chief of security for the entire chemical warfare, the director of chemical warfare at the United States Army Dugway Proving Ground. It's hard to believe that this family comes from Germany, goes to Pennsylvania, meets a man like this, and that whole family, the white entourage around Jim Jones, again, was very sophisticated, very wealthy, very educated. And there's more to this story than they want to connect, and that's what we're doing this for, to make these connections and to ask these important questions. Debbie Layton was born in Utah. Maybe that's why her mother got the cancer. Her mother was always afraid of cancer, and now there's government studies coming out of Provo, Utah, of people having cancer. A great number of them are having cancer because of the testing and the chemical warfare. There, again, I guess their karma is coming through. No wonder she had fear of cancer all of her life, and the attraction was supposed to be Jim Jones, who would cure her cancer, because she went to a meeting and I guess pulled out of her rectum one of these dirty old chicken livers or something. And this woman, who had so much sophistication, was supposed to believe that this freaky man on drugs and getting inoculations and wearing his dark glasses and acting so ridiculous, we're supposed to believe that she thought he could cure her cancer. Debbie was born in Utah, as I say, while her father was director of chemical warfare. At the Dugway, they moved out to California, where he went on to design weapon systems and missiles. And he had an international reputation for research. He lectured at Oxford, Cambridge, and University in Paris. He worked on monkeys also. He did research to test human allergies. He worked on monkeys. So did Jim Jones sell monkeys, and so did Dr. Jose Delgado have his monkeys at Yale University to implant electrodes and do experimentations. You see, there's an unanswered question here, because down at Guyana with his open port, Jim Jones had planes flying in and removing people. They haven't yet figured out where 200 or 300, at least 200 are. And some people went down there, and planes took them away, medical planes. They were supposed to be hurt by machetes or other things. And from down there, the word has come that people did fly them away. So we don't know whether there were experiments on 1, 2, or 300, or whether people were reshuffled back or forth. All we know is that they had to be destroyed. But it's interesting, a common denominator between Lawrence Layton and Jose Delgado and the mind control and Jim Jones, of course, is the monkeys. And I really don't know how many other people are experimenting on monkeys that you and I know. Another coincidence. Debbie's family had a mansion. They were wealthy, extremely wealthy. Pool, tennis court, $350,000 home. And according to one book, The Suicide Cult, the thing that attracted Debbie Layton to Jim Jones was her disdain for the people in Berkeley that were into the anti-war movement or the demonstrations. But in the New York Times article, it says that she joined the demonstrations and experimented with drugs. Actually, both of them could be true, because many of the people that were from the extreme right-wing counterintelligence or even the Hells Angels types can be very Nazi or fascist, but can also experiment in drugs. And there's no contradiction. They're really but one article says that she was in some of the demonstrations experimenting with drugs. They decided to send her to a school in London, and again, there's a fine lady who takes these tapes, Marge Gibson, who always says the British are coming. The British are coming because so much of these conspiracies goes back to the Bank of London and Montreal and London. And who knows? I have to give Marge credit. Maybe in this international story, London is certainly directing a lot of this. And Debbie goes to London, and the important thing isn't just that she goes there to this Quaker school in Yorkshire, England, where they tell her that her mother is Jewish, but she meets a man named George Philip Blakey. I hope to God he isn't related to G. Robert Blakey of the House Select Committee, but in this world of brothers like Alan and John Foster Dulles and goodness knows who, there is a George Philip Blakey here who was a boyfriend of Debbie Layton. And this is the sister again of the gentleman who just yesterday had said there 2 days ago that he was responsible for the shooting of some of the people in the Guyana airplane at the airport. Well, her boyfriend came from a wealthy family too in Northumberland, and they visited Ukiah. They went up in Ukiah, California, where Jim Jones was, and Larry Jones was up there. She went to see her brother, Larry, who was up there as a conscientious objector during the war. He was working at a hospital in Mendocino and came across Jim Jones. And Debbie came back with Philip Blakey from England, and they went from California and went down to Guyana. Now, according to this story, Jim Jones married Debbie to Philip Blakey, but the marriage was never consummated. They were separated by Jones, and according to him, it was never consummated. But Blakey went from England, and he left California and went directly down to Guyana to make that settlement down there. And that one of the big important questions in outlining this material that I'll be going into in a few minutes is, who are the original people that went down and got the land, and what were they doing there from 73 to 77 before the large mass of people were dumped down there? How many people came and went, and were there experimentations, and what were their qualifications, and who directed this operation? Now, this Blakey from England went down there. He not only went down there, but he survived. I don't know where he is now. I haven't seen his name in the news much. He went down to Guyana, and at the time of all these killings, he was on a boat. He was on a boat owned by the commune, and the boat went out and came back. A lot of the gold and diamonds are missing. Money is missing. According to Mark Lane in the literature, he says, hell, he knew what was going on, but so did the FBI and State Department and CIA, et cetera, et cetera. So how much did Blakey know? George Philip Blakey. That's a name to put on your list and see where he is and see if he's called and what questions he's asked, because a lot of the money came from Montreal banks down to and British banks, and money was coming from Europe, from the Layton family, from Lisa Phillips' father, or an unknown source. This New York Times says that there was some unknown source, some special fund that was going down there for Jim Jones. In addition to giving him $250,000 plus more, there was some fund from Germany, from her family, or secret special fund that was going down there. And I think that the Montreal banks, the British banks, should be investigated. I don't know that they ever will, but I think that this person, this George Philip Blakey, is an interesting character. He comes from a wealthy family in England and goes down to a plantation with a few poor blacks down in Guyana, an agricultural, in quotes, agricultural farm where you have mass beatings and punishments and sexual deprivations. And it's really hard to believe that people with that culture and education would stay there for 10 minutes unless they were supposed to. One of the important things here is that after World War II, after the American armies went into the concentration camps, we never had a psychological study of the men and women who met the people at the gates, who took their clothes, except for the one woman who made lampshades and soap out of the skin of various people. We never got a good psychological profile or an interview. These people went back to their homes near Auschwitz, Dachau, Treblinka. They had babies, they had families, they listened to music at night, they had a culture, they went to church on Sunday. They were ordinary people. They looked just like anybody else. And the whole emphasis of the German guilt was placed in Nuremberg on the very highest order that gave the people that gave the orders, like Watergate. We saw John Mitchell, and we saw Maurice Stans and E. Howard Hunt, the men caught at the hotel, and Robert Marty, and just a handful of people, Herbert Kalmbach, and a handful of people responsible, Robert Haldeman, John Ehrlichman. But the dirty tricks involved turning out lights at airports when planes were arriving, ordering food to be sent to Shirley Chisholm's campaign when people weren't going to be there, calling off campaigns, putting acid in Senator Muskie's drink to make him act irresponsible, and hundreds of people hired by Donald Segretti around the country for various, in quotes, tricks or violences, or the plans to create violence in Miami at the 1972 conventions, such as happened in Chicago. We never see the faces or the psychological profiles of the everyday 9 to 12, take a lunch break, 1 to 5 job. What do these people look like? They look just like you and me, and they get paid, and we can't separate them in our minds. They all melt in like ordinary people. Yet there are social structures, and this is very important. There are stratas just as strong as the caste system in India. There are social structures that separate the wealthy, landed gentry in England, years of education, the landed gentry of the Leighton family, the wealth. It's true that kids may have had too much guilt of having money or their father making weapon systems and they want to be anti-war people. But the violence that went down in Jim Jones' place, and this Grace Stone was on Phil Donahue's show talking about the beatings, and she had to stand on the stage and make everybody laugh and smile while they were beat, and people were beat until they had, one man until he had to have a catheter put in 100 times because he wouldn't say thank you afterwards, and they were beaten bloody and put out in shacks, etc. So what is the mentality of the landed gentry, the college educated, the scientists, the children of the educated, to allow a barbarian society in front of them to exist and then to be totally free of it, to show disregard for what happened, the people that are back now and the people that escaped, the coterie around them are let loose again, just like they were after World War II. Larry Layton, the son of Lawrence Layton, was born in 1946 while his father was at the University of Maryland. He was at Johns Hopkins doing drug research. When his father moved to Utah, it must have affected him with his dad, chief of biochemistry, the security and the activities that go on at an Army base like that. When your father is director of chemical warfare, it certainly must tell you that anything else you do after that has to be kosher, and to know your father is making missiles and satellites and weapons. Now, Lawrence Layton, in his interview, says, well, Larry was lonely, like Lee Harvey Oswald was lonely, or all the alleged assassins were lonely, James Earl Ray or Arthur Bremer, all lonely. He graduated from Berkeley High School. He went to Davis, where he met a woman, Carolyn Moore. Now, that's another woman who's out now. She hasn't been declared dead. Along with Mr. Blakey, this is an interesting person because she married Lawrence Layton, and her father's a Protestant minister in Davis. I noticed that in the cast of characters, and I'm creating these different personalities, they either are concerned with the church, related to the church, ministers, children, just like Mr. Lawrence Layton's grandfather was a Methodist minister, very strict. The ministers and the churches and the nursing profession run through this entire story, the wedding of the nursing profession with the churches. And Carolyn's father is a Protestant minister in Davis. They were married in 1966, and instead of military duty, Lawrence Layton went up to do medical technical work, medical technician up in Ukiah in Mendocino State Hospital, and that wasn't far from where Jim Jones was working, and that's where they met. In 1968, it was Carolyn Layton, the daughter of the minister up in Davis, who became the first member of the Layton family to join Jim Jones. And then Larry, her husband, went on to be a key lieutenant of Jim Jones. And he loved Carolyn, and Jones took her away from him. And then Jones stopped him from writing to his own parents and stopped making phone calls. And then the couple were divorced. And Lawrence Layton then fell in love with Karen, and she's now dead. She was down at Jonestown and was listed among the dead. And then Jim Jones took Karen away from Larry Layton also. He made Carolyn first wife and Karen the second wife watch him while Larry had homosexual acts with Jim Jones. He took the two women away from Larry, but he made the women watch him have homosexual relationships with Larry. And he was told what an awful father he had at home. Lawrence Layton and Jim Jones did a job of turning him against their parents, turning him against their wives, and turning them against themselves. And yet they all remained. On side 2 of this tape, we'll continue on with some more of not only the Layton family, but then a book, The Suicide Cult, and the chronology of the Jonestown story and what was left out of the suicide cult. Russell. This is tape number 367, side 2, December the 15th, 1978, and this is the third in the series on Guyana. We'll probably go on to 4 or 5 tapes, and then we'll do a rundown, update on the news, and then get back to some more on this important matter. Last week, I gave you a sheet that was enclosed with the tape of the categories, the way I saw Guyana falling into place after about 2 weeks of information coming in. I made that list. I updated it, and I'm putting that in this week's tape so that you can see, various researchers who are following this closely, how I add new files. I work with these boxes of files, 100 at a time I get, and label them. I can shuffle them, rearrange them, add numbers. The basic numbers stay the same, and if something fits in between, I just add an A, B, C, or D. I mean, there are 2 books out on the Guyana affair, one by Mr. Krauss in the Washington Post, and the other by Marshall Kilduff and Ron Javers. The co-author of this one, The Suicide Cult, came from Harvard University, moved out to San Francisco. I get skeptical of some of these Eastern people trying to understand this California violence or phenomena, which he obviously doesn't do. The most important category of my research always is the chronology, the overlay of the years. It's very important to see what happened at what time and then compare it to other events taking place at the same time. And I think after years I learned that the chronological layer of events is terribly important, the most important thing to read and analyze. And then you also can see how much is left out from one book and how much is left out from another, these important years. I took the book, The Suicide Cult, and went through it one time and typed up into about 40 or 50 pages everything in chronological order that was included in this hasty book. It only came out 3 weeks after the murders in Guyana. What Mr. Kilduff leaves out, of course, is the education and the qualification for Jim Jones to get juveniles, to be able to have them sent to him, even a person on parole who was sent or probation down to him, or disabled people or mentally sick. He doesn't ask those questions at all, why the state would send these children to him. He doesn't explain why he would build a barbed wire a fence with towers around the property in Ukiah. There's no explanation in detail of what went on in his life, 1950, 51, or 52. He doesn't explain, Marshall Kilduff, how the mayor of Indianapolis appointed Jim Jones director of Human Rights Commission. Just because he adopted an Oriental child and a black child doesn't really explain how he becomes the director of Human Rights in 1960. In 1958, in Indiana, he met Charles Beekman. Beekman is a common denominator, he and Mark Lane, through this whole era. Lane certainly surfaced after the Kennedy assassination and ends up with the woman who's in charge of money for hit teams in his apartment 3 weeks before all the violences came down. Along with Mark Lane is Charles Beekman, who had a 20-year friendship with Jim Jones, who's now being charged for the murder of 4 people down in Georgetown. The contacts of Bloomington, Indiana are totally ignored. He doesn't even mention the university and the work at Bloomington. The Brazil trip is passed over in the most half-assed way, and of course that was the primary connecting link of this whole story. The 1961 to 1963 trip of Jim Jones, when he was allegedly working with the CIA and the U.S. Embassy was bringing him his groceries and food and transportation, and he lived in a large home and took trips to Argentina and other places while stationed in Brazil. They don't explain in this book why medical and law enforcement authorities in Indiana were probing Jim Jones in 71 when he'd already left for California years earlier. He mentions that they were going into his activities in 1971, but doesn't even question what in the world they'd be looking into them then if he is in California. They mentioned that the state and federal Internal Revenue knew that he wasn't filing taxes after 1965, and he wasn't investigated. He also was protected by the Los Angeles Police Department, and charges were dropped when he was picked up there. He had 2 foundations that didn't file papers, and there were no prosecutions, but there's no connection between the IRS and the Internal Revenue and the tax deductions and the shenanigans at the present time with the same freedom that he had in 65 on up, where they didn't touch any of his papers or investigate how his money came in or what he was doing. In this book, they mention, when you get into the chronology, they took trips to Detroit, trips to Texas, Mexico, Washington, D.C. They don't bother to ask who he saw or why he went. I heard Marshall Kilduff on television. He said the title, The Suicide Cult, wasn't exactly right because it was a religious group that didn't think of themselves as any kind of cult. Once they got down there, Jones had made sure that there was no way to get out. So that isn't a cult. They weren't there of their own free will. They couldn't come and go, and people had no access to transportation or ways to get out. And he agreed that many were murdered just recently. This week in the newspaper, they said as many as 70 may have been murdered. But again, there's several hundred missing. And there are no autopsies except for 7 people. So the cover story, The Suicide Cult, is just that, and has no account of those trips to Mexico or Texas or Washington. Those cities come up in this book, and if you go back even to the first outline I did 2 weeks after the deaths took place, I had earmarked Houston, Texas, and Mexico as areas to look into. There are many names left out of this book. Of course, they don't seek them. It's a quick book, a fast book to make a buck, and that's all it does. The one good thing that gets lost in here that I want to call attention to on page 188, there are quotations from various newspaper people on what happened down in Guyana and interpretations from the Japanese press and people around the world. But the best explanation of motive was from Munich, Germany. I don't know if I can pronounce this. The Süddeutsche Zeitung from Munich, Germany, a newspaper down there, had an opinion on the suicide, what they call the suicide cult, and this is what they said in quotes. American society is composed of joiners, of people who like to form associations, where a bunch of joiners got together after World War I and formed the National Socialist Party. That's pretty heavy coming now, and I think that's what this is, a continuation of the Nazification of the world that was started by a group of joiners after World War I, and it's on page 188 of the book, The Suicide Cult. As I say, I took every date in the book and typed it up, page number, date, and what event took place. Of course, they begin with when Jim was born in Indiana. He married Marceline Baldwin, a nurse, in 1949. In 1950, they moved to Indianapolis, and then he jumps to 1964. He was finally ordained a minister in the Christian Church branch of Disciple of Christ. Keep in mind always with your chronology that from 61 to 63, he was in Brazil, and then when he comes home from Brazil, he's ordained. So we don't know what he was doing in Brazil. He didn't have a teaching credential. He wasn't a minister. He was down in 2 years in Brazil with the American Embassy. In 1956, they said he found enough money to purchase a former synagogue in Indiana. The synagogue was in Indianapolis. In 1960, the mayor appointed Jim Jones director of the Indianapolis Human Rights Commission. Again, no explanation of why, except that he had these mixed children, the white, Asian, and black, that were adopted. In 1963, according to this chronology, the People's Temple changed its name, People's Temple Full Gospel Church, and he said money was a mysterious commodity. He had enough finances to travel and promote himself. Now, keep in mind again, he goes down to Brazil, spends 2 years there, and then all of a sudden, he has a mysterious commodity known as cash and finances to travel. There's an interesting coincidence. There's several coincidences in this story that we'll go into, but Esquire magazine had an article naming 2 places that would be saved from nuclear bombs, one Ukiah, California, and the other Belo Horizonte in Brazil. Later, Mark Lane went to the Hunter family up north and told them he was a reporter from Esquire magazine, and he used an alias to get an interview from members of the People's Temple. Evidently, Esquire has, I don't know if there's any connection here, but interesting point. Clay Felker now runs Esquire. He was from the CIA, and Esquire magazine has always been antagonistic to various conspiracy theories. They've never helped the researchers along in any way that I've ever noticed, but it was Esquire that had this article talking about Belo Horizonte that sent Jim Jones down there. It may be that he read the Esquire story, but didn't explain how he took his wife and family and went running down to Brazil. In this book, The Suicide Cult, he leaves out the entire Brazil trip. He has 3 sentences to describe Jim Jones in Brazil. It said, Kuldoff says, he decided to take his family to Brazil for rest and scouting mission. For self-proclaimed missionary experiences, he enjoyed a brief stopover in backward British Guyana, later now known as Guyana. It was Guyana then, British Guyana, now known as Guyana. And that's all he says about Brazil and Jim Jones, and yet the Brazil trip would be the one that could unlock the medical experimentation, the future use of Guyana, the money he's going to have when he comes back to the United States, his future programming of blacks, and his Nazification and processes in the Bay Area where he takes his large mass down and prepares them to die, and their state is in a mind where those who aren't totally brainwashed have to be murdered, but they take this mass down there at 77 and they're slaughtered in 78, and it seems they knew all along they were preparing to kill all these people. In 1958, Charles Edward Beekman, who's now 42, became friends of Jim Jones in Indiana. That goes back 20 years. You have to read the book, The Control of Candy Jones, The Mind Control of Candy Jones. She was sent from New York City, where her offices for a modeling agency were across from John Tunney, and she was linked to the CIA through these particular people, the Tunney family, and through the FBI. And she was fed a line right to Oakland, California for her telephone mind control. And her first CIA trip began in 1965. Beekman and Jim Jones met in 58, but they've been friends for 20 years. And then Candy was trained to keep nothing in writing, to have hypnosis and drugs, to have a gross and global loss of memory, and she was taught to hate and to stay away from black people and to dislike black people, and the same for Jews. And in her book she tells about her hypnotism and the influence that the warfare state had on her. And she refers to the hard controls began to come down on her in experimentation in 1957, where she began to do her first work for the CIA. And Charles Edward Beekman met Jim Jones in Indiana. This was in 1958, and this is one of the questions we have to ask about his background, what he was doing then. Just several weeks ago, he killed Krista Amos, 10 years old, and Leon Harris, 21, Martin Amos, 9, and their mother. He cut their throats. Ron Javers and Marshall Kilduff make a big apology. They go overboard to explain why Jim Jones liked Guyana. They said in the 1960s, he liked the Victorian homes. The Guyanese people were sweet and friendly. They spoke English. The transportation wasn't too costly, et cetera, which is just, again, a lot of literary bullshit. When Jim Jones went down there, he hardly went into Georgetown. He compromised the officials. He had his women sleeping with them, photographing them. Mr. Burnham was put in by the CIA. He wanted isolated property. And after the death of over 900 people down there, the people in Georgetown that made the newspaper writers interviewed didn't even know that there was a Jonestown nearby and didn't know anything about it. Most of the people in the country didn't even know it existed. The architecture was the last thing he was looking for. Victorian architecture was the last thing Jim Jones was interested in. But again, these writers have to give you this cockamamie story to cover up what is the real story. Now, in this chronology, in 1963, Jim Jones gets a small fleet of buses and begins touring through the Midwest. This reminds me of Charlie Manson getting out of prison and going to Sacramento. And in the book The Family, Ed Sanders says, as winter oozed on, he bought a bus and equipped it with stereo and chicks and took an 18-month trip to the Southwest. Well, this is the way Jim Jones, with no noticeable occupation, he set up a storefront and had all this money, comes home from Brazil and has all this money, and he's taking a trip. Again, on page 23 of this book, it mentions that in 1971, the Indianapolis State Board of Psychology examiners was interested in studying the faith healing of Jim Jones and went into the medical and law enforcement authorities suggesting maybe they should question his practices, but decided they were powerless to go into what he was claiming he was doing. And again, that's interesting that it's put for this year because Jim Jones had left there in 1971. He wasn't even there. In 1970, in Indiana, the Secretary of State revoked the corporate license. Jim Jones had a corporate license for a company called Wings of Deliverance and one called the Jim, that's Jim, Lou, L-U, Mar, I guess Marcelina Corporation, a nonprofit enterprise. They never filed annual reports for tax deductions. They were founded in 1965. They got tax foundations from 1965, but they never filed with the IRS. In 1966 to 1970, Wings of Deliverance never filed corporate tax returns. The Jim Lou Mar Corporation filed only the first year, yet the state never prosecuted the corporations. The IRS never investigated them, and another link. According to Kilduff and Jevers, this is another link in his good luck. You see in the files that I gave you where I have Jim Jones favors from the IRS, we put it right into that section. Where we have favors, the LAPD's arrested, we put it right in there. With the IRS today, they never touched Jim Jones' funding or financing or the accumulation of millions. They had a hands-off policy in 65 when he formed the corporations and came home from Brazil, and they have it right up to today. The Washington Post had a big article this week. Jim Jones' story, Guyana, is over. The whole story is over. And then below, it talks about the secret $10 million that are in banks in Bahamas, France, England, Switzerland, Panama. And they don't even want to know where the money came from or who deposited it or where it's going to go. But the story, for all purposes, is over. Jim leaves Indianapolis in 1965. And goes out to the West Coast. Marvin Sweeney joined his temple, W-S-I-N-N-E-Y, and Jackie Sweeney. They both joined his temple. He worked for an electronics firm, and they show up in Ukiah, California. Again, names to see if they died down in Jonestown or if they still stayed with him. Marceline became an inspector for a state nursing home. He built 40-acre home. He had property, 40 acres, and he had a home for boys and 3 convalescent centers. Now, what license, what expertise did Jim Jones have to take care of boys and convalescents? The state gives them the money or gives them these bodies. Why put up a tower, guards, dogs, literally a closed-off camp? And, of course, the question is go into the records and find out who were the boys in 1967 up in Ukiah. Who were the boys? Their names, where are they now, and what was their condition? Are they alive? Are they dead? Did they go to Guyana? Who turned this piece of property, human property, over to Jim Jones and Marceline, this nursing home where he built this place on 40 acres? He called it a temple with special tax favors. He not only got these people delivered to him and had this compound, but he got into local politics. He was appointed to the grand jury. He was chosen as the foreman. He became director of Mendocino and Lake County's Legal Services Foundation. And then he won over a man named Tim Stoen, whose name you've seen in the news a lot, who was the county council up there in Mendocino, and he used him to work for him as his lawyer, as a legal counselor. Stoen and then later Grace Stoen, they were together up there and gave legal services. They later moved to San Francisco, where Joe Freitas, the district attorney, was asked by Jim Jones to put Stoen as assistant district attorney in San Francisco, and he got that position coming down from Mendocino. He was placed as a counsel there. He was a county counsel in Mendocino, and Jones had followers from the parole officers, radio dispatchers, sheriff services, and moved to San Francisco, bought the building on Geary Street in 1972, and then the money again was pouring in from these various people, and they were having a lot of cash donations, and he was able to buy that temple headquarters, which was formerly a synagogue in San Francisco. In 1971, Deborah Layton, the young woman I talked about on the first side of this tape, went to People's Temple. According to Kilduff, she wasn't one of those rootless people, one of those anti-war people marching around Berkeley or the hippies. She wasn't one of the rootless. She had, in quotes, a strong sense of mission and discipline, a great contrast to the aimless, drug-oriented ferment of Berkeley. That's page 114. The discipline and the mission reminds me of the background of her German mother and her father with his military defense, germ warfare expertise, and they go on to say she became the financial secretary of People's Temple, the confidant of Jones, and that she would flash $65,000 in Social Security checks a month that she stashed away, but then she had a little reserve, in quotes, and then in quotes, for experimental community in Guyana. And this money was coming in that was to be put aside for an experimental community in Guyana. Interesting, because Lawrence Layton was into agricultural work and experiment for the federal government, and one of the requirements was an agricultural station as a cover for Jim Jones in Guyana. The chronology, I'm taking all this chronology from the Suicide Cult, then I'll take the other books and the newspaper articles, but I'm just using this one book now with these various dates. And Jim Jones went down to Los Angeles and got another church in Los Angeles, a third synagogue. He bought a synagogue in San Francisco, Indianapolis, and then Los Angeles on Alvarado. He moved down to L.A., and then he begins traveling. Now, it's interesting, page 42, he talks about Jim Jones in Los Angeles, but there's a void there from 71 to 73 where he doesn't bother to pinpoint a date at all, and yet these dates are very important. And then he says he began traveling. He was flying around the country. He had a retinue of bodyguards and aides. He talked to ministers in Detroit, Houston, Texas, and St. Louis. Of course, ministers are the group, the missionaries that ran the School for Assassins in Mexico. And whether or not there's a connection, we'll find out in the future, I hope. But he took buses down to Mexico and people to Disneyland and Washington, D.C., and the inauguration of Jimmy Carter, he took people back there, bus loads. He founded a record company called the Brotherhood Records. I don't know if it's any relationship to Mike Kerb, our lieutenant governor in California now, who was in the music business for the CIA as a front. He came out here and worked with Mr. Vagary and the most far right wing of counterintelligence that I mistrust Mike Kerb, our lieutenant governor, who's in the music business. So we have to, again, ask the most unthinkable questions. Where is the Brotherhood of Records organization? What records have they made? It was supposed to be music sold by the People's Temple, a large interracial youth choir and orchestra. To read Kilduff, you'd think it was like the Mormon Tabernacle, but I've never heard anything about the music he sold, and I'd sure like to get those records. I bet they're collector's items. But in late 1973, according to this chronology, and this is the important part, besides the years 61 to 63 when he's in Brazil that are left out of the book, this is page 88. He says, another destination for People's Temple's money emerged, a newfound colony in the jungles of Guyana. Now, late 73 is when the UCLA school to study the causes of violent behavior was certainly on the rocks, and it was not going to be allowed to go through. And by December 73 was the time when Earl Bryan said in California, I had that on the tape, I believe it was last week or the week before, they had to have some alternative means for studying these people and studying violence because Dr. Marcus Foster had just been shot. Well, page 88 of this book mentions a Dan Phillips. That's the name you have to follow and look into. A Dan Phillips went with Jim Jones and a dozen top church leaders, and they went to Guyana with a large sum of money. The grand jury should call Dan Phillips, or they should find out if he's among the missing, or if he's dead, or who he is. Who were the 12 men who went down to Guyana for the original purchase? In other words, are these men from the Defense Department? Are they former veterans? Are they medical men? This is one of the clues about the first purchase of that land. According to this Kuldoff book, which of course he hasn't researched or thought along these lines, find Dan Phillips, who went with Jim Jones and 12 other, in quotes, church leaders. Call those 12 men. Identify their names, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, up to 12. What were their occupations? If they were top church leaders, what were their occupations at the time they went down there? How did they earn their living? Were they any with police departments? Were they former veterans from the war in Vietnam? Were they with the Defense Department? What were their occupations? What was their medical training, their legal background, government connections? Who set this up? Were the 12 down there when the 900 died? How did they die? Are they alive? Where are they now? This is the team to look for. This is one of the big clues. Those dozen top church leaders. Now, Marshall Kilduff has written this with Ron Jabber, so he must know there were a dozen that went down there, and I'm sure they weren't just the black slaves that were picking the vegetables. They had a bank draft from Barclays of Canada to deposit money in Georgetown. Each had $5,000 cash. They had a bank draft for $600,000. It was late in 1973, as I say, when that school was halted that I talked about before. It was in late 73 when Earl Bryan said, we have to find another way. When the National Institute of Mental Health, Health Education and Welfare, the governor, Ronald Reagan, Stanford Research, UCLA, the CIA were looking for ways, along with the Boston Hospital doctors, to work on blacks and study suicides and mass fingerprinting. So the question is, who went down to Guyana and who purchased the boats down there? The requirements were that they have an open port. Who built the airstrip? Who arranged the purchase of the boats? Who manned the boats? The first 4 went down there, according to this book on page 92. The first 4 went down there December the 9th, 1973, all members of the inner circle. December the 16th, another 12 went down there. Now, the criteria that Jim Jones had, he had 2 main criteria. A, it had to be isolated. Remember, he said later, once I get them down there, there's no way for them to leave. A, it had to be isolated, and B, they had to grow their own food to be an agricultural mission. Again, Auschwitz, Treblinka, Dachau were isolated. What were the conditions of having their own food then? There would be no excuse for going in and out, or people purchasing or leaving messages on if they could eat their vegetables, supposedly, I guess, and put people to work from 6 in the morning till 10 at night and give them a good long day to conk out and go to bed, and no questions asked. The conditions, 4 other conditions Jim Jones said they wanted was it had to be accessible to water. They have an open boat with river, right on the river. The land had to have the potential for agriculture for them to work on. It had to be largely uninhabited with few villages around, and they were protected by the jungle and uninhabited. There was no one close by. And 4, it had to be close to Venezuela. If the settlers had to escape, they could flee. This is page 93 of the book, The Suicide Cult. Even in bad books, bad articles, you pick up information, as I say. You skim away the bullshit, and you come out with a little bit of the story of the conditions of what went on. So this is very important. They should name all the bodies that returned from Guyana, all 910. They haven't given out a list of that yet, even though they have passports and they have the fingerprints and the bodies before they cremate. Name each body there, state whether it is a black or a white body, and its age, children versus old people or middle ages, where they came from, cities like Indiana, Texas, the inner circle, who set it up, how many of those people out of the original 1,200 or the people that set it up originally are missing. Did 4 and 12 go down with Jim Jones? Those 16 that had nothing to do with this. They just set it up like you set up a missionary for 20 people in Mexico that could send assassins all over the world for 20 years. 16 people could do this here. They had that land from 72 to 77 until this large brown group of black people were brought down there. 73 to 77, what was going on for those 4 years? He was setting it up from 71. And how many took a boat to Venezuela? Now, these are impossible to ask, these questions, but those are the questions that give you the answers to what went on in Georgetown. The Suicide Cult book describes the use of the media. Again, what UCLA School was planning while they did their experimentations and electrodes and brain surgery, they were supposed to have access to the media with interviews praising and lauding their research. The People's Temple in San Francisco had a newspaper. They circulated actually about 60,000 papers a day. The money was put up by Dr. Carlton Goodland, a black doctor in San Francisco, who I had called about 6 years ago. He's having a conference on black problems in San Francisco, and I had called and wanted to participate in the conference, and I accused him of being a cover-up bastard. That was 6 or 7 years ago. I was contacting Carlton Goodland and sounding him out, and it turns out he was the doctor of Jim Jones all this time with his complex medical problems. The newspaper had pictures of German concentration camps, Ku Klux Klan rallies, and so forth, and they had radio time on KFAX Saturday. So the media in San Francisco was projecting this great organization with the Democrats up there and the news media, and praising Jim Jones and lauding his work while something sinister was being planned down on the northern coast there of South America. This tape is about out now, so next week we'll continue with part 4 on Jim Jones and the slaughter down in Guyana.